you start the Org Topologies method not by looking inside your organization. That's one of the further steps. The first step is to ask yourself, which is a very simple and a hard question at the same time, why are we doing this? Why do we exist as an organization? People need to remind themselves who the customers of this organization and what are the key problems they are solving for them. And only when this is clear, then you can open up the organization and then try to map your org units in relationship to that customer or customer problem. And many IT organizations, they have a very internal view on the situation. I was witnessing several team topologies adoptions where what leaders would do, instead of talking about the customers and the strategy and the needs of the organization, they would open up an architectural map of different components they have in a software product, and they would attach teams to those components to improve flow on working on those parts or components. And this is a very internal view. And I'm sure you can improve some things, but the risk is you might actually just rearrange some decks on a Titanic, as we say. You might just be doing some local optimization, and it might not have any positive influence implication on like real things that matter.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Boundaryless Conversations podcast. On this podcast, we explore the future of business models, organizations, markets, and society in our rapidly changing world. I'm flying solo, but we have a great guest with us today, Alexey Krivitsky. He defines himself as an end-to-end consultant, like many of us, I would say, that can range from the details of technological implementation and development up to sitting with the board and deciding about strategy and organizational development. He is a co-creator of the Org Topologies methodology, which was related a few years ago and now culminated into the release of an interesting book called 10x Organizations, which is also a co-author. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hi, Simona. Thanks for having me here.
I feel like sometimes most of us working on complex organizational systems are somehow converging into very similar ideas. But it's probably a good moment for you to give our audience an overview of what Org Topologies is and maybe also how you got there, because you also have a very extensive past in agile and LESS and other methodologies. So I think it's good for you to maybe give an introduction to our listeners, especially of the reasons why you felt at some point you had to create this framework.
Yeah. We don't call it a framework between us because, the word framework, especially in the agile community, has already some kind of a shadow. So I think an approach, a method is just a more generic definition. So why we created? So I come from the field of organizational coaching, consulting, and of course, for the last 10, 15 years, we all have been pretty busy with the so-called agile transformations. Mm-hmm. So there are many reasons, right? One reason that I would like to share here is that we have noticed working with our clients, with the leadership teams, is that yes, they're doing some implementation. They roll out some framework. It can be safe. It can be something else. It can be team topologies, unfixed, whatever, Spotify model. And they are doing that. And then when you ask them a very simple question, like, guys, like, what are you trying to actually improve? Or where do you see your company evolving in the next couple of years? Like, what are the new capabilities you are building in? Not everybody, but in some cases, they have hard times answering this simple question. And we figured that a lot of companies are in motion, doing this change, doing this transformation, and sometimes even retransformation after transformation. We can talk about that too in the podcast. And we figured people are lacking some very basic tool to reason about the current state and about the future state, and then have a better clarity on the direction of change. So, Simona, we created this, a 2x2 map how much of skills being expended and how much of work being expended. And essentially, we spend 5 years now in this, I can say, research project, like a hobby a research project, where we try to understand for companies where they are on the map, and we figure out almost every company, every division, every team, every individual can be mapped on this simple 2x2 org topologies map. And once you map something, then you can have a discussion where do you want to evolve this organizational unit. So this is just one way to explain to our audience like why org topologies, and of course there were some other reasons.
Part of the direction of work that you guys have been looking into is the convergence between the how the organization is managed and set, and the what. So the product side, the value proposition side of the organization, how this value proposition can be distributed across the teams. Because, sometimes my frustration with some of these agile frameworks that speak about flow and agility, whatever, I'm sometimes frustrated because it seems like there's no talking about product and customer. Most of the talk is about the actual work and obsessing about making it fluid, but then it's unclear how the work will actually end. Will it end in some kind of product that somebody uses, or who pays for that, who budgets for it? Are these things also part of the approach that you guys have developed?
Yeah, one problem that you've just clearly mentioned, Simone, is that people bring this, I would say, buzzwords like agile and agility and other things, and they use them like these things are defined. But I mean, every company would have a very different understanding what agile is, right, in quotes. And even people within one company, even within the same so-called agile transformation, might also have different definitions. So we are not using any of this terminology in the org topologies method. We don't want people to assume it is given or it is clear. We want them to actually, as you said, understand what's the relationship between the what customer wants and why the company was actually created, and the internals of an organization. So you start the org topologies method not by looking inside your organization. That's one of the further steps. The first step is to ask yourself, which is a very simple and a hard question at the same time, like, why are we doing this? Why do we exist as an organization? And people need to remind themselves who the customers of this organization and what are the key problems they are solving for them. And only when this is clear, then you can open up the organization and then try to map your org units in relationship to that customer or customer problem. And you've mentioned like team topologies and other methods that focus too much on flow. I think flow is good, is not a bad concept in general, but a lot of these ideas, no matter how well they are described, will be applied in an organization in a way that this organization thinks. And many IT organizations I have worked with, they have a very internal view on the situation. So I was witnessing several team topologies adoptions where what leaders would do, instead of talking about the customers and the strategy and the needs of the organization, what they would do, they would open up an architectural map of different components they have in a software product, and they would attach teams to those components to improve flow on working on those parts or components. And this is a very internal view. And I'm sure you can improve some things doing it this way, but the risk is you might actually just rearrange some decks on a Titanic, as we say. You might just be doing some local optimization, and it might not have any positive influence implication on real things that matter.
if I understand well, in your method, let's say, there are certain end states that are desirable, I would say, or at least this is my impression. Would you maybe chime in and clarify that? So,
yeah,
broadly, if I can maybe introduce it to our listeners, your framework has two axes, as you said. One is the scope of the work. So, scope of the work moving from single task, so largely functionally distributed work, or I would say fragmented pieces of work, into customer domain focus. So essentially, as I understand it, is you are in charge of broad customer domain problems, or maybe a product development, something like that. And on the other side, there is an axis which is about the complexity of capabilities that a unit runs on its own. So it's, I don't know, a purely functional thing, or a purely single skill thing, or more like a systemic thing that can create full autonomy and customer value. So is there an end state for all organizations, or maybe depending on what type of organization you are, in your experience, you want to position somewhere in the board?
Just to simplify your explanation of the map, the vertical axis is essentially, in a very simple terms, are you working on the outputs or are you contributing to the outcomes? And the difference between outputs and outcomes is that outputting more outputs does not necessarily contribute to a greater good. So if you have a team or an org unit or a person who's just doing the same thing over and over again, some outputs, maybe they are chopping onions in a restaurant, more chopped onions do not necessarily add any value. And outcomes is, of course, something that customers understand, something that customer value. And if you're working on the outcomes, then you actually see where the value is, and value is usually changing if you are, say, in the product development. So if you're working on the outcomes higher on the vertical axis, then you have more freedom to decide what I'm working on today and what I'm working on tomorrow. And the horizontal axis, in very simple terms, is going from being incomplete, just doing some function, as you say, and being dependent on the others, or on the right side, being complete, being independent, being autonomous. And of course, this intersection gives you interesting combination. So this was a bit of a debrief of the method. About the final state. No, there's no final state, and there's no better or worse place on the map. And I think, Simone, this is like a critical for our readers to audience to understand. Org design, and this is the field of org design, is very contextual. There's no right or wrong in organizations in general, in abstract terms, but there is something that is fit for purpose or unfit. We've just discussed flow. Is flow good or bad? Well, it depends what you want to improve on. It depends what you are optimizing for. It depends on which kind of environment you are working with. So we've been developing this method for a very broad audience. Org design is a very deep, and you might even say boring domain not many managers would like to dive in. So our mission of Org Topologies and the 10x org book is to make that field of org design accessible, interesting, modern for the audience. So we had to simplify a lot of things. So one simplification, of course, is the map. And the other simplification is the three topologies. We have identified resource topology, delivery topology, and an adaptive topology. Like as these idealized, canonical, stereotypical management systems and org designs that organization create around the people. And none of them is good or bad in itself. But if you are, for instance, working in a very dynamic environment, and most of my clients are in product R&D, so product research in development software. In this environment, every feature you build is unique and new. You never build the same stuff twice. You can say the customer demands are changing a lot. So it's a very highly variable environment, you can say. And if you are working in this environment, just utilizing skills of individuals just because they have them, like in the resource topology, or just focusing on flow and speed of teams in a delivery topology, makes very little sense. So these topologies are very much contextual. So like if you are an assembly line, a kind of a company, right? So which means your product is the same, it is standard, there's a very little variation, and there's enough demand to produce this product for many years to come, and the process is repeatable. The assembly line, the typical like Ford factory, you can say, or a Taylorism, is very much what I would advise to implement as an org designer. On the other hand, right, if the stuff is more dynamic, if every item coming out of your assembly line requires different skills, different ideas, different level of creativity, is not repeatable, then this assembly line concept or resource topology is not fit for purpose. So there's these three places you can be, roughly speaking, on the map, and depending on what you want, they can be fit or unfit for purpose. And the goal of this method is twofold. First, help you identify your existing topology. Because I don't know if you agree with me on this, Simone, or not, but I believe that every organization is already kind of optimizing for something, whether they want it or not. Every structure creates some culture, behavior, amplifies beliefs. So the first part of the method is understand what you have. And it typically be one of these topologies or a combination of those. And the second part is ask yourself a question like, is it really driving our business strategy? And if not, then improve and maybe find other places on the map you would like to evolve towards.
What is the thing that you normally put on the map? Is a team or a unit or what?
We have been coming from this field of like agile coaching and stuff, where usually agile coaches, Scrum masters would define something as a team and work a lot to improve the well-being of the teams. And we wanted our method to be compatible with that thinking. So this method is optimized in the first place to map some kind of a coherent unit of work, let's say a team, or broadly speaking, group of people who, so like when you put a dot on a map somewhere, that dot of a map will represent either one individual, if that person works solo, right? Or likely it will represent a group of people who work together on something common, which will typically be defined as a team. But then you can, of course, group teams together and look at the department. You can map at the higher level, like dependencies between the departments, or you can open up a team and look at the individuals, and even like you can put AI agents there and stuff. So what you are mapping is very much up to you. But when we teach these concepts in our classes and courses, we typically help people find these coherent smaller groups of people, like agile teams, scrum teams, and start with them, because this is a very typical these days how the companies are thinking of their structure and themselves. And of course, actually, in 1 year from now, the tendency is to have smaller teams, like in software engineering, smaller teams, and just maybe solo developers pairing with AI agents, and that would be a unit of a team. And then you can, of course, map them too.
Again, I'm looking at this from the perspective of I'm seeing a lot of convergence here, right? So basically, everybody's talking about the same thing, with their own story. You come in from your story, so you brought your own approach. We come from another story, we brought another approach. But I'm really keen to think that we actually start to need a common language for us to understand each other. But that's another story, right? How am I mapping your approach to what we do, for example, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting to see that typically when I work with organizations, we have more of an approach that tends to focus on the unit level. So typically when I speak about a node in an organization, I'm not talking necessarily about one team, I'm talking about one capability. So something that has a clear value proposition, it provides a certain catalog of services, for example, or capabilities, and it can have a P&L. So you can actually have a boundary where you can have agreements, contracts, you can exchange value for value, right? So if you look at these, and I typically look at these nodes from the perspective of evolution. And we started from working with the higher approach a few years ago, and higher has roughly three type of units in the topology in Random Hay, which is micro enterprise, and they separate the user and node micro enterprise. So the user micro enterprise is the micro enterprise in touch with the customer, let's say, while the node is the one that is in touch with the other units to support with common services like enabling elements. And then there is the shared service, which is something more like an overhead provider, like HR or something like that. And then if you look at word-array mapping, for example, Simon word-array framework, you have a similar approach. You have somehow the idea that you have an innovate, leverage, and componentize flow. So there are these three things. And also, if you look at domain-driven design, there are three types of bounded context. There is a core bounded context, which is similar to what we would call a user ME. There is supporting bounded context, which is similar to what I would call a node microenterprise. And there are generic bounded contexts, which is something that I would call like shared services or something like that. And if I look at your topologies, I can think that maybe resource topologies are more useful for the generic domains, so the domains which have very predictable and commoditized services, let's say, while the delivery domain is more keen to maybe the supporting elements, the platforms, the internal capabilities, and the adaptive domain, the adaptive topology is better for the user MEs, the core domains that are in touch with the customer, they need to adapt. And it's interesting that if you look at your delivering, your topologies, both the resource and delivery topology have some kind of directing unit, that basically they need to depend on someone or something giving them direction, okay? While the adaptive topology is more self-aware and more autonomous in setting direction, which is the same thing we experience because typically in organizations that run the three topologies together, the three units in the topologies, you have some units which are more dependent on the board decisions, like, that typically depend on objectives. Like, for example, if you have HR, you typically give HR objectives in terms of SLAs, in terms of performance, while other nodes, which are the ones in touch with the customer, are typically entertain a relationship with the board, which is more that of an investor-investee. So I make my plans, and then the board will invest on me to support my strategic development. Long story short, coming back to you, do you see this resonance, and do you see that organizations have all the topologies often, especially big organizations, have all these topologies together in their systems?
I think you're right saying that you can map these different levels of variability or complexity or evolution to different topologies, and you can see them alike. But I'm not a scientist, I'm a practitioner. And from the practitioner point of view, and I work with organizations that have excess complexity. Uh, yes, you can say they can have all kind of topologies, and of course it might make sense to have a resource topology for some kind of a function, maybe HR or ops, and it might be okay to have a platform team be represented in a delivery topology, and then you can have some adaptive teams on top. That will sound very logical to managers and to teams, and this is how a company typically will be structured. But when I'm called in as a consultant, I'm not called in to do some theory discussion. I'm actually there to solve real problems. And the typical problems that I know exist, and I try to solve them for many years, and that's why I have to build Org Topology, is that, for instance, if you believed that something can be commoditized, like it is right on the worldly map, some kind of a platform, and you need some kind of a good flow of that platform, and it sounds like it's a boundary of its own, it's a domain of its own, you would, as a manager, typically create some kind of a org unit, to own that platform. So that's where the domain-driven design and org design become kind of intertwined, and maybe for bad reasons. Because yes, I understand modularization of software. I understand the concept of services, reusability, and something can be a platform. No problem about that. But the interesting dynamics happens when you attach a team to own that platform, and only that team, for instance, is allowed to modify and evolve that platform, and other teams will be just consuming, so to say, their interface. It will sound very logical in all these methods which you've listed, and you can have a nice, even Org Topologies mapping on that. But as a practitioner, I know this can create a lot of interesting friction and dynamics. For instance, Simone, I think some of our audience will recognize a problem where a platform starts to live its own life. If it's a software product and you figure out, or this part needs to be platformized, it should be a platform, that typically means there is a product owner, product manager owning that platform. That person, of course, has some kind of a budget and asked for a vision. So she would come up with a roadmap, some kind of a predictable delivery will be asked of her. Then she would have given engineers, teams, and those engineers, of course, will be hired to be able to work with that specific technology. That becomes a world of its own. And I worked with large German organizations where they were these platforms, and essentially every team becomes this kind of a
small kingdom,
isolated kingdom. Exactly. You see the dynamics. So yes, you can justify this with great theory, domain-driven design, worldly mapping, Org Topology, whatever. But there will be some very interesting problems. And the problem is that, yes, they're independent kingdoms. They will be optimizing locally, not globally. And they will try to avoid, changing stuff when they have their roadmap. So I was, for example, working at a large German company, Xing, so-called German social network, which is kind of dying. But I worked there like 10 years ago when it was super fantastic place to work. But there you would have a team per each layer of the architecture, like very classical method. And because everybody would have their own small view on the problem, right? You will have this feudalism, many kingdoms kind of wanting to like each other, but also having very conflict priorities and needs and goals. And just to be very clear now with an example, there was one specific feature that many teams had to implement in different parts of the architecture. Essentially, users had to provide their business information to be shown on the profile. And you can understand this is web, iOS, Android, iPad app still was there, and it should go from a front, any of these front ends, down to backend, to the database, APIs, back and forth. This feature took 2 years to implement and added field, essentially. took 2 years to implement, and not because people were not working, not because it was a bad company. No, like engineers were top notch. Scrum masters, myself, were like amazing. Everybody was working perfectly. We had retrospectives. We were improving. We had, everything you can check was there, but the emerging quality of the global system was so that it was super, super slow to do something which was not initially planned on the roadmap. So, yes, you can justify any separation, any compartmentalization, but maybe we should not have these theoretical talks. We should really look and see what's happening in the organization. And that's where I spent last 20 years actually working with real problems. And I tell you, yes, this local thinking, my kingdom versus your kingdom, can be very well justified on paper and with any of these books and a method, but it can be very painful for the leaders, stakeholders, even developers, and of course for the clients, because those clients have been waiting for 2 years for the edit field, and they were actually suing the company for not being able to provide them that very simple functionality.
This is something that it's impossible to avoid. Organizations have to deal with trade-offs. Whenever you separate a whole system into nodes and teams and give these teams a relative level of autonomy, you potentially incur in these small kingdoms dynamics, and the system view gets sacrificed in favor of a more individual view, right? At the same time, ideally, in an organization, you want to have a system that reflects the real nature of the work. So I think, generally speaking, looking at an organization from a domain-driven design perspective and recognizing bounded context and recognizing that these bounded contexts need autonomy is not a bad thing, right? It's a good idea overall. But
I don't agree.
Okay, let me explain, then you can maybe tell me what you think about it. I assume that the problem when you separate units and teams and give them a relative amount of autonomy, because otherwise you just have a very big team and then it's very hard to manage. It becomes a hierarchical, that's inevitable. At least this is my perception, is that you lack two things. You lack frameworks for these units to align and collaborate. So, for example, when there is a feature that somebody needs from the market, okay, you need to have a framework for this need to go through the organization and generate a collaboration between nodes, where every node has a relative skin in the game in the positive outcome of the collaboration. And another problem that I often see in organizations is that risk is not properly identified. So, for example, whenever you have a monopoly, you introduce a risk, or whenever you have somebody influencing the development and direction without, for example, directly investing in that direction. So using, for example, a hierarchical drive or force, that's a risk you have, because essentially somebody from the top can set a direction without having real skin in the game of the system. So I think that you can solve the problems that are generated by separating domains into more autonomous teams by creating the tools for these teams to collaborate, and at the same time ensuring that whoever wants to push a certain direction needs to be able to take the risk by investing in this direction. So, or sharing the outcomes with the units that are involved in making those outcomes happen. So it's more a problem of language for collaboration than a problem of separating the units.
I like this discussion, and I like not agreeing with each other, because then we can, right?
Yeah.
Then we can have a very fruitful, rich discussion, because when everybody agrees, there's nothing more new, interesting happening.
Yeah, but that's why we wanted to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. I know you invited me exactly for this reason. So, listen, you've thrown several definitions.
That's my specialization, sorry.
No, but like you said, bounded context.
Yeah.
You used it several time, and I'm opening Gemini, And now to help me understand what there is, I know what there is, but I don't want to misinterpret. So let me read, okay, one paragraph. In domain-driven design, DDD, embodied context is a central pattern that defines a clear boundary within which a specific domain model applies. Inside that boundary, all terms, definitions, and code have a unified, unambiguous meaning. To put it simply, it is a semantic boundary that prevents different parts of a large system from confusing the same word for different things. So essentially is a container of meaning. And it actually, I find it funny that we talk about the boundaries, and your company is called Boundaryless, but this is probably another topic, or maybe you can explain me later on.
Yeah, I will do that.
Let's stay on the topic. Bounded context. It's about your domain language. It's about your terminology. It's about speaking the customer language, right? Never in this definition, which I've just read, they mentioned org design. They never mentioned here ownership of bounded context. So I think you are making, Simona, a very similar thinking bridge that a lot of people are making, which is merging domain-driven design with org design, assuming that if there is a bounded context, if there is a domain, then it needs to be owned by a given team. And this is not given. There is no law of nature which makes you want to give one domain to one team. This is already a decision management can do or not do. So, and I think this is where a lot of confusion about team topology and domain-driven design and wordly mapping happen, is that these people merge these very independent concepts. Again, I think having defined customer domains, extracting domain language, and using that language is in engineering is super helpful. Then you can open up your class diagrams and you would see those entities, right, which are there in a real world. Like in a banking environment, there will be an entity called a transaction or a bank card or a statement. Fantastic. As a software engineer, I'm all for it. But whether you attach a team to it or not, this is a very different topic, Simone. But somehow in our industry for the last 5-10 years, because of very low quality books out there, which became very popular for the same reason that they are so bad written, then everybody actually would understand them because there are very little reasoning in there. In those books, I'm not going to call names, but I know what you mean. They merge these topics together and they say, whenever you have a domain, you need to have a domain team. This is not true, because you might have a team, no problem, but you might have maybe several teams co-owning together several domains. Can be a very different organizational design, which, by the way, will make people go from a domain to domain, learn different things, jump different contexts, be able to follow the customer value, get rid and avoid dependencies and all that. So this is exactly the Org Topologies 10x Org book, where we are trying to be very clear with these terms and not overload people with another, bullshit layer, excuse my French, of the stuff, but really go to the basics. And the basic is there is freedom. You can assign teams and people to whatever they want. There's no single law of nature which makes you create platform teams or domain teams or stream align teams this is a choice, and sometimes it is the best choice, sometimes it's the worst choice. But let's step back and think slowly about that. And I'm a very slow thinker. And I would encourage everybody to, when somebody is throwing a terminology, open up your favorite AI and really understand what they mean by that. And why we on this, Simone, I'd like to use this opportunity to debunk another terminology, if I may, which is the famous Conway's law. Because people also put Conway's law in this discussion. And, when you bring somebody like Mel Conway, who wrote this article in 1968, and is one of the most popular articles somehow, but when you put this in a discussion without going deep and thinking slowly, it's just the end of a discussion, because people will typically say, and yes, and Mel Conway said exactly that. Bam. End of the discussion. No, actually, and I just opened the Conway's Law paper on my computer. It is available. It is HTML website. Actually, it said the opposite of what people think he said. If you go very down to the last paragraph of his work, he said the following: because the design which occurs, I'm just reading now, because the design which occurs first is almost never the best possible, the prevailing system concept may need to change. Therefore, flexibility of organization is important to effective design. So essentially, he says there will be architecture, there will be software design. Yes, no problem with that. But that architecture and that software design will never be right, will never be correct. Because, first of all, well, we know how this works. You never know what customers want without, giving them and learning that you were wrong. And secondly, the same happens with architecture. You can never get it right before actually doing something. And he said the following: we must keep organizations flexible so that when our understanding of architecture changes, we don't need to restructure our organization to restructure our architecture. And Simone, I'm finishing, but once you figure out there's a domain and you attach a team to a domain, good luck to flexibility. If tomorrow something changes and you like to re-architect or merge domain or extract new domains, or maybe those domains were not really correct, you have now two problems. First, you need to change the code and the architecture. We know how to do it in software. But the second problem is that now you have also org design replicating the same structure of your software. So Mel Conway actually said, do not replicate the structure of your software in your organization. Keep it flexible. And the adaptive topology on the Org Topologies map is a collection of these ideas. Simona, how can we keep organization flexible so that whatever happens inside is easier to change? That was my excursus to debunking things that people use every day and don't really, never have just spent 20 minutes slowly thinking about them. And I don't mean you. I mean, people who abuse this terminology, but actually somehow miss the point here.
In general, I especially agree with one of the points that you raised, that the passage of the article from Mel Conway you mentioned is one of my favorite, because basically Conway is saying everything is contextual, so you don't just have to drink the Kool-Aid of the Conway law. You have to think about it in the context of your organization, and you need flexibility and everything. So I think the other error we can make is that we completely strawman another framework because we believe it's complete bullshit. So I think I see signal everywhere. What I'm trying to do is at least in my practice with organizations, is to distill a set of primitives, let's say, that the organization then has the responsibility, as you said, to take a decision about. I'm also very thankful that I do not work with many software-centric organizations, to be honest. I tend to work with organizations where the concept of a bounded context of a unit is less attached to a piece of software, but is more attached to an actual organizational capability that can deliver a complete value proposition. So like, for example, a factory or I don't know, a logistics entity or an hardware development that develops actual piece of hardware. So when I work with organizations, I always insist on another thing that you said, that you need to have a ownership of a boundary. Whenever there is a boundary, there needs to be ownership of this boundary, right? So otherwise, if you just put boundaries in everywhere and then nobody owns the boundary, you have this small kingdom dynamics, right? Because people, tend to just crystallize their scope of control, but they do not have any skin in the game in making mistakes or optimizing for products that nobody wants or something like that.
I think, Simone, the level in the details. So when you say if there's a boundary, there need to be ownership. And I've just tried to explain why this is not always the case. Imagine there is this e-commerce website where customers can search for products, put them into the basket, buy them, come again, buy again. And of course, there will be some functionality on the website, which is search. A customer should be able to type some, misspelled product name and actually find the right product or products. So there will be somewhere down the line some functionality that actually makes this for users happen. Search functionality. Is this a domain? Is this bounded context?
No, but from my perspective, I think you are exactly clicking on something that I wanted to clarify, right? And again, I'm thankful that I do not work so much with software companies, but in my point of view, that would never become an actual organizational boundary, right? Why? Because it's not a complete value proposition that you deliver. So that would be just maybe one team, if you want, inside a broader unit that is maybe the e-commerce unit. And again, I'm simplifying because we're not doing mapping here. But that's what I said before, right? This is where maybe you can have a delivery topology in your point of view, because this platform serves many other teams, and maybe there is somebody in the organization, and I'm going to make an example now, which wants to have a certain behavior because it can see the big picture, right? So, for example, I was working with this hardware development company. I'm not going to name it, but it's a founder-led company where there is a very strong strategic perspective, and the founder wants for example, a certain strategy to develop over time. And this company, at the same time, has multiple capabilities. For example, it has a very broad hardware development capability, on top of which multiple units are developing pieces of software to serve vertical markets, right? And so I would never say the platform that develops the hardware is completely autonomous to do whatever they want, because this would probably harm the capability of the software companies that build on top to actually be free to build and strategic, right? So in this case, the founder would say, the platform unit, I'm not going to give them, for example, an objective of increasing their margins, but rather I'm going to give them an objective to stay true to a certain strategic pipeline so that the others can build upon. So it's not going to be a full, what can I say in your terms, it's not going to be an adaptive topology. It's maybe going to be a delivery topology, right? And again, this is a choice, because this founder is taking a risk by saying our platform doesn't serve the ecosystem, it serves only our internal entities. So I'm taking a risk, and this risk, I'm owning it by saying I'm going to invest into the platform. Because another choice could be, another customers I'm working with, I'm doing it, okay, the platform can be an adaptive topology, but then they own their own P&L and they can serve other customers, right? They can also serve other customers from the ecosystem, because somebody needs to own the risk. The point that I'm making is that we need to be able to give people the primitives to understand that the major drivers of organizational effectiveness is risk-taking, risk owning, and collaboration frameworks, because otherwise everything becomes like just a hierarchical nightmare where somebody decides and the other execute. That's the point that I'm making.
I very much like, Simone, that you use the word choice, And you made these two very different examples. So yeah, it's exactly the choice whether some context, some boundary, some domain will be owned solely, exclusively, or it will be co-shared. And I think it's not even black and white. There's a whole spectrum from like private ownership to shared ownership, and you need to discuss that. And I very much like the second thing which you just said is that like in your world, like a search functionality will never be a kingdom of its own. Maybe one message to our audience is that if you are thinking how to improve your organization, it's not a rule of nature again, but it's my observation that there is a very high chance that the domains or boundaries that you currently have are defined too narrowly.
Mm-hmm.
It's very likely that you have a so-called search team or iOS team or some kind of a payment platform team because of many of the history of Taylorism, of factories, of misunderstanding, of other things. I'm not
parcelizing work all the time. People are parcelizing work all the time.
Yeah, so this is likely happening, and actually over time, those compartments will get even smaller and smaller and smaller. I think if you really would like to benefit from the intelligence of your people and the AI intelligence, which your people can use these days, the boundary should be broader and as broader as possible. Right. And you need to find ways to broaden them and challenge your existing lines that you draw on your org chart and stuff. And that's the first time I'm mentioning AI in this talk, which is surprising because usually that's the first one I throw in because that's May 2026 and AI is in everybody's mind. And Simone, I've been traveling with this 10x org book recently to many meetups and conferences. And the message is like this topic of org design and where your boundary is. It's always been a topic, but now I think it becomes even more of a hot topic because of the AI adoption.
I agree very much with you that we shouldn't obsess about separating team duties inside a boundary because, for example, the approach that I follow, whenever one of my customers define a boundary, which is typically a product owning or a capability owning unit, I always say, try not to impose from the top how teams should be structured and how work should be managed. Try to consider it as a black box because the people in the unit will figure out how work needs to get done. So it's a contextual choice. So you don't, I read a strong advice against saying in this organization, I don't know, for example, everybody uses team topologies or everybody uses Scrum RTEs or whatever, right? Because this is really a one-size-fits-all thing that doesn't fit with the contextual nature of the work that people are trying to get done. So I would really strongly advise against mandating the managing approach of the work inside a product boundary or a capability boundary. So that's something that I think resonates with what you were saying. Let's get to a close. Wanted to ask you, first of all, if you have any breadcrumb to share with our listeners. You have been studying a lot of approaches and working on this for years now. So most likely you have found some gems and like books that or readings or other things that people can look into to ensure that they do not get too much red pilled on anything.
Yeah, I think I'll just go shameless and just
yeah, of course, your book.
Why, right? You just mentioned breadcrumbs. So these, some things that people can, go and pull and learn more. So essentially, that book which we just published in end of February a few months ago, essentially it is a collection of breadcrumbs, you can say. We studied a lot of material on org design, org change, AI adoptions, and we brought like the common dilemmas people have and actual problems people have to the table in a very simple and digestible form the book is written as a business novel, so it's even easier to read. But then, of course, it's just a small window. This book is just a small window into the big domain of org design and organizational change and transformation and org psychology and whatnot. And then people hopefully can follow, pull the lines and go deeper into that. What I read these days and how I read these days, two maybe pieces of advice to our audience. We are in a agentic age, 2026, May. We're currently recording on the May 15th. Do not read alone is the mantra I'm using. So we have this great opportunity, capability given to us almost for free, to have a PDF of your book, upload it to your favorite LLM, and then after you read a chapter, you can go to LLM and actually have a meaningful, slow thinking discussion similar to the one I just had with Simona. You can argue about the chapter. You can ask GPT to provide you the opposite arguments, right? You can change sides so you can broaden and deepen your understanding. You can even ask GPT to make you a test, a survey quiz to test your understanding. So never read alone. If you're buying a paper book, always try to get also like a PDF a version of that. And I think there you can ask for more breadcrumbs and more links. And this is how we should be learning today. The other piece of advice I would like to give, and by the way, in our book, we actually embedded AI assistant. There's a QR code, and you will go to a custom GPT who knows about the book, even if you don't have a PDF. So we want people to use AI to read our book and go deeper in that. The second piece of advice where I'm currently going to, I'm following like maybe 30, 50 handlers on Twitter, X, and I built myself a personal assistant with Cloud Code, which daily would scrap those accounts and will create me a digest of new things. And I have three kinds of digests. I have a digest about recent scientific papers in AI. I think it's helpful, even if you're not a software engineer, to read at least some of the scientific things about AI. I have another budget, which is like a business digest, like a business implications of AI, and I have some more. So essentially, one Twitter handle I really recommend people to follow is from Andrej Karpathy. Andrej Karpathy, he used to be a director of AI at Tesla 10 years ago, and he was a co-founder of OpenAI. And that guy amazes me, Simone. He's like the deepest person in AI because he knows how to build AI and he builds. But the way he explained that and the way he philosophizes about the implications of AI is just so easy to follow. And every week, essentially, he comes up with a very cool new idea of AI implication. The one which is super popular a month ago was LLM Wiki. So everybody can build their knowledge base with AI, and I've built myself. So I don't just read alone. I upload the books to my wiki, and I disassemble them into parts and into concepts, and then I can have a discussion with my AI on the very broad, domain. And this is just wows me every day, these capabilities. So don't read alone. Use AIs to help you go deeper. Ask AI who you should follow for your interests. Ask AI to create your digest so you can find those breadcrumbs for yourself and explore and experiment. That's the year of AI experimentation, I think we should all be doing.
Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the conversation like I did.
I did. Thank you so much for having me.
It was a overdue, I would say. So thank you for joining us. I know you have been traveling for your workshops and book presentation events. So I appreciate that you find some energy to show up today with us. And our listeners for sure will have tons of insights from this conversation. And of course, for our listeners, you can head to our website, boundaries.io/resources/podcast, and you will find this episode with all the transcript, all the things that Alexey has brought up to your attention. And or maybe you can throw the transcript into an LLM and ask the LLM to tell you what it thinks about it. So don't read alone. Don't drink too much Kool-Aid. Try to always find your way to stuff, and especially org development. Thank you so much, Alexey. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me, Simone.
And to our listeners, of course, until we speak again, remember to think boundaryless.